Going. All right. Follow the rules. Yeah. Okay. So I'm doing a synopsis for the outline for chapter 6. And the reason I think this is very important is because this is a very complex argument. A logos with an unstated telos, and we've seen some of the telos statements. I'm going to go really quickly through it, but through the stuff in the start. So he's at the Sea of Galilee. Remember, Passover was the sacrifice of the Lamb of God. It says specifically, there's like 5,000 of these guys testing Philip, testing Andrew. The disciples recline, all of it, the 5,000 recline, supposing him to eat and drink. Jesus' good gratefulness, the bread and fish, much desired. And then we're up to this point. So Jesus to the 12, lead together that anything, and when it says anything in Greek, the word is anyone or someone. So it just doesn't mean, it doesn't just connote the stuff, the food. It connotes also the people. So he says to the 12, lead together that anything, anyone or someone may not be destroyed fully, which is a really strange way of using the verb, the words. We know, okay, all you English, well, everybody, all the English speakers, right? When you hit something in a book that is not the right word, you know that the author is trying to tell you something, or the author is obtuse. Well, this writer is obviously not obtuse. And when you're paying what do we figure? I don't know. I didn't calculate out. You're paying $20,000, well, probably, yeah, $20,000, maybe $30,000 to write this document. How much per word? A lot. So every word matters, and you're picking every word and choosing every word specifically. And remember, this is a logos to tell us. We think that the author, we believe in our minds that the author is telling us a story. We always hear about the stories. They're not stories. They are accounts. They're historical accounts. However, they're more than that. They are Greek logos to telos accounts that the author is trying to focus our minds. In English, we're trying to tell, I hate to say the story, we're trying to tell the account. If someone's writing an account of what happened to them at the Battle of Gettysburg, right, in English, they're trying to tell us their personal experiences of what they saw at Gettysburg. That is not the Greek writer. The Greek writer is trying to tell you not just the physical things they saw and heard and experienced, but to give you the overall structure of the in their mind, the philosophy, the logic, the reasoning behind what was going on. And that's why John, more than anybody, we get the account of what happened, and then we get a dialogue. Just like C.S. Lewis tells us, you know, that's modern literature, and that really is modern literature. I go more and more about it, but that's not the point. The point is, Jesus tells them, he leads them together. By the way, in Greek, the lead together is synagogue, and that's the word that's used, synagogue, that anything, anyone or someone may not be destroyed fully. That word is reused later. Jesus is, and this is the sign. Okay, you thought the sign was the feeding of the 5,000. That is not the sign. The sign may have been feeding and symposium and the expression that was going on at that, the teaching that was going on at that. That's the point. But the sign was that Jesus is the prophet and should be king. That's what the people concluded. Matter of fact, even the disciples concluded that. To the point that what did Jesus do? Jesus said, nah, I'm going to the mountains. Now, John doesn't express to us necessarily why he went to the mountains, other than he did not want them at that time to state that he was king or the prophet. There are good reasons for this, but one of the main reasons, and I'll bring this up because John will later, to be king and to be the king and the priest, what do you have to have happen to you?
Anoint.
You have to be anointed. The Christ, Christus, means the anointed one. To be king, you have to be anointed. And by the way, who's going to anoint Christ later? Mary. So, number one, he can't take his position as king, nor as priest, because there's no one to anoint him. However, we'll find out what he is later. That's interesting. The big deal is they want to make him prophet and the king, and Jesus went to the mountains. He left. Okay, so the disciples went by sea to Capernaum without Jesus. And that's when they were attacked by the gods of the wind and the sea. This is obvious in the text. Halfway there, Jesus came to them and he said this, I am. Don't be afraid. I am. Don't be afraid. We know the I am statements almost always are after the signs. So we'll see a sign, we'll see an I am statement. The I am statements are very specific in Greek. This one, I am, is very interesting because he didn't say I am the sacrifice. I am the lamb. I am he'll say other things like I am the door. I am the resurrection.
The gate.
The gate. There are all kinds of really cool things that he will say. But in this statement to the disciples, he just says I am, which connotes that he is God. Because that's what, remember when Moses was in the burning bush? And he said, what should I call you? And God said, I am. I exist. Yes, sir.
So that would have been in Hebrew. Do you know what the Hebrew might have been?
Hebrew is Jehovah.
Yahweh.
Yahweh. Yes, Yahweh we think. The problem with Jehovah, and I've gone through this before, Jehovah is the consonants. Adonai are the vowels. They take the vowels from the consonants because they don't want to say the name of God. The second commandment is not to take the. It doesn't say don't take the name of the Lord in vain. It says don't use the name of the Lord. Period. So of God, Yahweh. So they don't say the name of Yahweh, to the point that in the 118th Psalm, which is repeated at the Festival of Booths, at the end of the Festival of Booths, the high priest stands up and he goes, blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh. And he wouldn't pronounce it before the people because he didn't want to say the name of God. That is when the Messiah is supposed to stand up in the temple and announce himself. And guess who did that? I think it's in John. We'll see it at Festival of Booths, where Jesus stands up and says, I am the water of life, which is, know those I am statements right after the great sign, which we usually don't consider a sign, when he says he calls himself Messiah. But anyway, so Yahweh, the reason Yahweh is interesting, Jehovah, Yahweh, take your pick, because we don't know the way it's pronounced, and the Hebrews do not either, because they separated the vowels from the consonants, and they use the Aramaic pronunciations of the vowels anyway, because remember, does Hebrew have vowels? No. The Masoretes had to add the vowels so that so they could actually pronounce the text. And you can't read. Do not take your Masoretic Bible and read it in a synagogue. It's not allowed. You have to have the original text without the vowels or the vowel pointlets in it. So anyway, I think it's really cool. And going over the name of God and the names of God, people have studied it, but it isn't the different, like Jehovah Jireh and all this other stuff they got, right? That's not what's really cool. What's really cool about the names of God is the basic fundamentals of the pronunciation and the vowels and the consonants and the way that it's been looked at by Hebrew society, which goes into, by the way, the New Testament, because in many of the New Testament documents, you know what they do, right? When they say theos, it's TH dash dash. They don't put the vowels in theos. In Jesus, Jesus is really hard because it's all vowels almost, but it's dash dash S dash dash. And when they do Christus, it's the Chi Rho dash, and the ST, whatever that is, S and T. So it's in tau. So it's they intentionally pull the vowels out. Why did they do that? For Jesus, the Holy Spirit, Hagios Pneuma, and for Theos. Because, and the early church, the early church presumed that Christ was God. So anyway, and this comes out of this too. But anyway, it's really interesting. He says, I am. In other words, he is making a claim to be God. Don't be frightened. They take him in and they arrive. Now, I cut yours shorter because I wanted to share the space, but you had the long version anyway. So, the throng of disciples came to worship Jesus in Capernaum. And the question was to the rabbi of Capernaum. Who's the rabbi of Capernaum? Jesus is the rabbi of Capernaum. That's where he was living. That's where he was in a synagogue. For some reason, we don't want to know that Jesus had an occupation, that he worked as a rabbi, or that he was attached in any way to the Pharisees. But, because he was like, I don't know, whatever. It's the way the history is, okay? So he was the rabbi of Capernaum, and they went to the rabbi of Capernaum in Capernaum and asked him, how'd you get here? Because they went to Tiberias, right, looking for him, and eventually had to walk or take ships up to Capernaum to find Jesus. The answer that Jesus gave him was this: it isn't the signs, it's the food. Toil not for food, but for life perpetual. This is what Jesus tells them in answer to their question about how to get here. In other words, we have multiple signs going on, multiple semeon. The first semeon was that he fed 5,000 people and gave a symposium. The second being that he, in a wonderful and amazing way, was in Capernaum with the disciples. And that's what they noted. So the first thing was, how did you get here? And his answer was, it isn't the signs. You're here for the food. Toil not for the food, but for life perpetual. And they say to him, we want the toils of God. Get it? Toils, food, toils. They're equating the two. Now, I want you to remember this. What is always the toil or the food of God?
Word.
Well, we like to say that, but that's totally euphemistic.
Manna. Jesus.
Manna could be, but if there's even a closer one, they know all about the toil, the food of God. The sacrifice. The sacrifice, okay, to us, all right, what do? We go to church, we have communion, we do, but to us, all right, how many of you bring in your lamb, right? No, I guess we're not, right? But they are. Remember, every time they're going down to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is where, okay, the temple. They're not worshiping, well, how do you worship in the temple? The sacrifice. The reason you're at the temple is the sacrifice. The sacrifice is the toil, the food of God. And so, guess what? We were talking, at the beginning it says the Passover, right? So they said, we want the toils, the food of God. The toil of God, this is what Jesus said. The toil of God is to be persuaded of the Son of Man. Ooh, interesting. So they say, give us a sign of manna like Moses, right? You're the prophet. We want to make you king. We want to make you king because you're going to feed us. But give us a sign of manna. So you see the toils, the food of God is a sacrifice. But if you're God, if they're not really saying if you're God, but they're saying if you are the prophet, like Moses, then give us the food, give us manna. Answer from Jesus, not Moses. I'm God. Or actually, most literally, he says, Moses didn't give you the food, the manna. God gave you the manna. Okay, so what just happened? At the beginning, what did Jesus do? He gave them food, just like manna, just like God. This is an unstated telos. This is a beautiful unstated telos. John is trying to make us, John is not trying to make us. John is showing us that Jesus Christ is God, and it's that if A equals, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C kind of thing. It's a logos. It's a logical argument that leads to only one telos. Okay? So, he says, it's not Moses, but God gave it to you, and that it presumes that he is God, giving life, not manna. This is hugely different. Giving life is much different than feeding your belly, right? I mean, you could have a disease or you couldn't process food, gluten problems, right? You can't process food with gluten. If I give you food that you Mao gave the people what? Grass. The people in communist China were eating grass under Mao Zedong because they just wanted to fill their bellies. How good is grass for?
Very bad.
Very bad.
Works for cattle.
Works for cattle, doesn't work for human beings. And if you don't know this, go back to your biology classes because you can't process this. There's the cell structure, cellular structure on plants is so great that you got to cook them. And even cooking grass is not good. But anyway, so you need more, or you need to do like rabbits. Oh.
Stop. Just stop.
Look, this is just basic stuff. If you were farmers, you'd be like, oh yeah, we're farmers, right? Anyway, so he says, giving life, not manna. So they say, give us this bread. Give us this bread. They don't want the life. They want the bread. They want the food. They want something to fill their bellies. Give us this bread. You see, this is all about sacrifice. It's all about, it's very, very deep argument. Jesus' answer, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's very similar to what the woman at the well said. Give me this water.
Give me this
living water.
Give me but you see the difference? The woman at the well, like I said, she is the brightest of every person in the gospel because she asked for the living water and presumably knew what she was asking for, not just to slake her thirst, but to slake her problems, her issues, right? And we didn't even get into theological points, but obviously she wants something more than she had, right? These guys, what do they want?
Daily bread.
Give me some bread. Give us bread. Give us bread. I am the bread of life. If you're convinced, you won't thirst or hunger for life. For life. You are not convinced. That was his statement to them. You are not convinced. I am, and this is one of those I am statements, I am the bread of life. Remember in Greek, when I make the I am, ego eimi statement, that is an absolute statement. It is not meant to be taken euphemistically, although we do, because we like to do that. It is an existential statement. It's a statement that is in Greek. Matter of fact, in most languages, especially ancient languages, when I say ego eimi, I am not making just a simple statement of existence. Matter of fact, I think I've said this before. I won't try to belabor the point, but I want to make sure it's kind of clear. If I were to say, I am a man, the Greeks would say, huh? You're obviously a man. Especially with nudity in the ancient world, whatever, it would be obvious to every person around that you are a man because of the way you dress, because of the way you hold yourself, because of your authority, your station in life. And by the way, the Greeks all bathed naked. So if you didn't know, there it is. And they didn't, to them, nudity was not like, and matter of fact, let's just face life. Nudity up to probably the Victorian era, and even in America, was not what we expected today. Parents, children routinely saw each other naked because what are you going to do when you have a 2-bedroom or even a 1-bedroom cabin, right? What are you going to do when you're bathing? Dad gets the water first. Oh, there's not much left because it all slopped over the side, but everybody gets their time, and the baby's last, right? And hopefully after all that, whoa, it's kind of mucky in there. But nudity was just very what? Okay, we live in such pristine lives, but a lot of the outhouses were multi-holers, right? So, mom and pa, having their conference, right? Where hopefully the children aren't hearing.
Well, have you seen the excavated Roman baths? They just have a row of seats there.
They do. Yeah, the public, the Greeks and the Romans, especially the Romans realized very quickly how important sanitation is, especially if your city is going to grow. And their cities were not much bigger than 20,000. And Pilate got in real trouble for building an aqueduct into Jerusalem because he used the temple funds. But that's neither here nor there. The Romans and the Greeks were big time into, health, things that we would consider very healthy in the modern era. However, right, if you go to Ephesus and you see their potty things, they're like, you're probably nudging your neighbor. But it's like, okay, but to us, we have we're allowed privacy because we got space and we got money and we can, build things like that. But in the ancient world, it just wasn't that way. And it even gets worse, but I won't go into all those details. Anyway, I am the bread of life, which is a very, very deep statement in Greek. No thirst or hunger for life, you are not convinced. You are not convinced. The will of God is that you are convinced. Okay? And these are the subnotes to that. The will of God is that you are convinced. And convinced of what? Convinced of the Son of Man. What does it mean to be convinced of the Son of Man? Okay. Now, we have a real issue in our society because I think we're kind of whacked historically. That everybody says, if you believe on Jesus, that means you think he lived. He existed. That's not what Jesus, look, when you're looking at Jesus, you're looking at the Christ. What is there to be convinced about? That he's God. Exactly. That is what you're convinced about, is that he is God. When we make this statement, do you believe in Jesus? Well, we don't mean, what's that? Satan believes in Jesus. Anyone who knows anything about history cannot but believe in Jesus. Because Jesus, I have more historically to tell me that Jesus was born of a virgin, lived, walked, was crucified by the Romans, and came back to life. I have more proof of that than of Julius Caesar, Epictetus, Hippocrates, almost everything in antiquity. I have more evidence. And so if I were to say, do you believe in Jesus? A good historian would say, of course I do, because Jesus had to have lived on earth. But that's not what your question means. When I say that, I mean the Greek sense. Are you convinced of Jesus? And convinced means that he is what he says he is. And by the way, what did he say he is? I am the bread of life. I am basically God. That's what you're convinced of. So the will of God is that you are convinced. And number one, according to Jesus, convinced, I should not destroy fully. Remember the last thing he told the disciples? He said, pick up the leftover food so that the people, will not be destroyed fully. I told you that what that is in a symposium, we always want at the end of the symposium, okay, fill out, here's the, what do you call it? Here's the survey. Usually they don't ask, what did you learn, which they ought to ask. What did you learn in this? They usually ask you, what was the food good? Was the lighting good? Was the place good? Were the speakers okay? La, 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 right? What's that? Were they friendly? Yeah. All right. You don't ask that of a Marine boot camp guy. But anyway, that's what they ask at the end of the symposium, right? And so obviously when Jesus sent out the disciples to get the food, it wasn't just to get the food. He said it so that no one is destroyed fully. In other words, so they understand. I don't think the disciples fully understood or comprehended. So anyway, I don't think they were fully convinced, but we get to where we are. Yes, sir.
Well, today, on the way to Capernaum,
Emmaus?
Emmaus,
Yeah.
they were saying he was a prophet. So they still weren't convinced, even afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. You might ask yourself the question, I think this is a wonderful question of proof text. What would make all these people be willing to give their lives for somebody they just thought was a prophet? Because how many prophets do people give their lives for? Prophets.
Well, the Muslims, plenty of them would give their lives for Muhammad, not in the same way, but.
That is an interesting point, yeah. But I don't know of any historical evidence where anyone gave their life for a prophet. Mostly people gave their
Killed the
lives
prophets.
because of a prophet or killed the prophets, yeah. Remember the great prophets of Baal? That's hilarious. That's the funniest story in the Bible where, who is it, Ezekiel or Elijah, right? And they're all cutting themselves and doing themselves, and Elijah says, okay, take water, put it over the sack, put water over the sacrifice, put water on the sacrifice, and all of a sudden, kabam! The fire comes down, takes the sacrifice, takes all the prophets of Baal. It's like, okay, all a good work, right? Anyway, that is just hilarious. Anyway, will of God is you are convinced that I should not destroy fully. In other words, and Jesus says it later even, Jesus has given power by God over the entire cosmos. And Jesus is the control, is the power of the cosmos, which is why he makes this statement, I should not destroy fully. And then he goes on, I will stand everything up again. Now this is really, really important because he doesn't specifically say that he will resurrect from the dead, but there's an insinuation here because he is the bread of life. The problem for the Judeans, here's the problem. The problem is that Jesus said, I am the bread. Basically, he said, I am the manna. I am the sacrifice. That's what he said to them. So it's a problem for them. The other thing he said that was a problem for them is he says, I come down from God. And we get a proof text. This is a beautiful proof text. For your friends who don't think this way at all, here's a proof text. Because Jesus said, I am the bread and I come down from God. And the Judeans asked this question, is he not Jesus, the offspring of Joseph? That's a proof text. The proof text is that even the Judeans knew that he was born, and yet he makes a claim that he has come down from God. Really, he's making a claim that he's God, but whatever. This bothers them. How does he say he is from God? This is a question for the Jews. How does he say he's from God? Because this, but how does he say he's from God? Because of Simeon. These guys went really fast from, hey, you fed us, you should be the prophet, you're the prophet, you should be the king, right? To what? Give us some more food. Were you really? What? It's really interesting. Because people are like this anyway, right? Jesus repeats the statement above. Father, thee having sent me, will drag him to me, and I will stand him up to the final day. I know this is kind of, to us, it's a little bit convoluted thinking, but there's a lot to be seen in this because, okay, if you're worried, and okay, you got three different people here, right? You have the disciples, the real disciples. The real disciples are those who are trying to be convinced. They see these things and are going, man, there's something about this. I really want to know what's going on. Obviously this guy is, look, gods don't feed you, right? Nobody does this. Nobody says things like this. This is just amazing. So I would put the 12 plus others in that camp. You have some that are seeing the things and they're not convinced. They're like,
Yeah, this guy's Joseph Mary's son. Don't we know that? And how could he be doing this?
yeah. Well, maybe he's the prophet. Maybe he should be the king. But we're not convinced that he's God or from God or whatever. He may be from God, right? But he's just a guy. He's just this guy, you know. That's kind of what their statement is. And then you got another group. There is another group, and the other group is totally convinced. I would put the woman at the well. I think Mary and Martha, and even we'll see more about Lazarus. But you have people that are absolutely, completely convinced. They fully understand and comprehend. John does not give us that group because they're not important. If you're already convinced, who cares? What's really great in a logical or a logical argument, okay, if you have the three groups, okay, you're doing a, what do you call it, a student debate. You're doing a debate. You don't care about those that are convinced. You care about those you need to convince and those that are kind of sitting on the wall, right? Those are the ones you care about. And by the way, that's where you make your arguments to. I don't need to make an argument to the convinced. They're already convinced. They figured it out. What I want to make an argument to are those who aren't fully there and those who don't want to be or not there at all. So anyway, he goes and he says, Father sent me, will drag him to me. This is a really interesting statement because, in other words, all those people, those 5,000, the women, children, God has dragged them to him. Doesn't matter how he dragged them. You know, they were curious, they were interested, they thought this guy was pretty cool, we want to hear more about it, right? Even the food. It doesn't matter why he came. They were dragged by God. The problem is that if they are not convinced, right, then none of this other good stuff can happen. All who know God come to me. Basically, he makes a statement there that is a direct statement, I am God. And he makes a repeat. I am the bread of life perpetual. And I will stand up the convinced. So what we're doing is we're getting pieces of the argument that all of a sudden get put together in this statement. I am the bread of life perpetual, and I will stand up the convinced. Now, we in our culture and society, you know what we've done? We say, okay, this means that you'll be resurrected. Well, it can mean you're resurrected. Remember Pharisaic rabbi? What is and we'll see this again. We will see this big time. What is the Pharisaic position on the resurrection? That you will be physically, bodily resurrected at the end of time, right? So you die, they don't know anything about what's with you. Maybe you're just, whatever, you're rotten in the grave, and hopefully you'll be resurrected, not as dry bones, but with body and flesh and everything, right? But that is their view. What about Sadducee view? Sadducees, priests? There is no resurrection. You're just dead, right? That's it, period. Now the Greeks, this goes back to the Greek thing. And we're going to see this. This is really interesting. Because if you remember, the Greeks got sarx, psuche, and pneuma. So sarx is the flesh. When you die, sarx, dead, gone, right? Psuche. Well, the Greeks would say, well, that stays around, kind of, because psuche is thoughts. Your thoughts, your emotions, your ability to think, right? That's because you think, well, Rousseau said this, not Socrates, but I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I exist. So to the Greeks, the idea of thought, or psuche, was not like the view of the breath of life, the nefesh, in the mind of the Hebrews, but rather it was not the breath that made you a human and thinking, was because you had psyche, period. And the pneuma is your free will. So the Greeks would say your psuche and your pneuma, we would say soul and spirit. We mix the two together, which is really funny because the Greeks in their minds kind of did too. In other words, your sarx is gone, but what's left? Your thoughts and your soul, your free will. That is the part of you that is real and existent. So the stand-up convinced, the Greeks are immediately onto this, but also the Pharisees are immediately onto this. The problem is Sadducees are really against this. However, remember, if Jesus is the rabbi of Capernaum, he's basically has very rabbinic, he's saying rabbinic things as well. And I'm not saying you expect Jesus to be thinking like a Pharisee. He's thinking more like a Greek in some ways, but in our way of thinking. Our way of thinking is much better. You have something?
I was just thinking of the Greek concept of Zoe, life itself. They would connect that then to psyche or suke and pneuma, but not so much to sarx. Of course, once you're dead, you don't have it. So
yeah, that's interesting because Zoe, and you're right on. Zoe, life to the Greeks, is sarx, suke, and pneuma. So if you're going to say anything, then life can include all of those. The Greeks would say that piece beyond life, in other words, outside the gay, right? Well, we draw the picture of the cosmos, right? The cosmos, and we say outside the cosmos is the plenum of everything. That's where God exists everywhere. But then within the creation, there is the cosmos. That's the creation, and within that is the philosophia, that which man can know, and then the gay, which is the physical realm, which the Greeks would say sarx. But if you notice, remember when we draw the picture, is there any real demarcation or difference between any of those? No, they're subsets of one another, right? So in other words, a subset. So if you're not connected to the gay, physically like with sarx, then your pneuma and your psyche is within the cosmos. It's still within, right? Anyway, I know this is kind of hard and it's not, the Greeks would say this is really obvious. The Hebrews Jesus is teaching the Hebrews what this means. Because you can't use terminology in a language that you don't have.
I was curious if the Greeks would have had a concept of once you leave the gay, you go to the Uranos. Was that a Greek concept before Christianity? Or
the Greek concept is that the gay is physical. So the gay is the world, the measurable physical world. And then outside of that, they would call it, and the philosophia is a good way of expressing it, but the philosophia includes like Hades, what they would call the Elysian fields, where the gods exist. All the things that humans and even to a certain measure gods can understand, they would call that the theophilia. But the philosophia is what man can comprehend within their thing. So they would say that when you die, the Elysian fields and all those other things are within the cosmos. They're within the creation. They would say we don't know where, but they have to be within the philosophia. Because by definition, the philosophia is what you can know, what a human can know, right? Now, once you become extra human, so to speak, right, then what is the philosophia? Well, you would think, yeah, much more than that, right? Jesus would tell you that within the state of the cosmos, that what you can know now as a free soul, right, as a soul within God, is now you are inheritors of Godship, right? We'll see that later. You'll actually make that specific declaration that you are, and remember, we saw in Hebrew. Remember in Hebrews? They said you are inheritors. You are like God, right? You're like Theos because of the inheritance through Christ. So the presumption is once you get past the point of gay, now you can see the entirety to a degree of the universe. You'll never understand everything like God does, right? But your level of understanding would increase. Now we're talking about philosophy and theology in terms of Greek stuff. But that's still, it's still pertinent, right? It really is pertinent because what we are doing here is the Hebrews have their Hebraic worldview. The Greeks and the Romans, the Greeks have a Greek worldview. The Romans have a Roman worldview, and we've talked about how they're different. Jesus obviously is trying to use the terminology of the Greek worldview because he doesn't have any other tools. If you have a certain set of tools in your language, you can only use the tools you have. You can't be like Jack Vance making up words. I mean, yeah, I guess you can. It makes a fun fictional book. But when you're telling people about the realities of life, you can only take what you have and explain it. It would be impossible for Jesus to say, hey, God is, I'm God and I'm a four-dimensional being, but you're seeing my projection in the physical three-dimensional world. And all the people's brains would explode, right? Because it's outside of their understanding. The words even that he would use, he can't use the words that they have to understand that. You can only use the words within your own culture and language. So he's explaining this in terms, remember, to mostly Hebrew people that are Greek speakers. And he's trying to exert ideas in their brains, right? Eat from the bread of life and you'll not die off. That's a direct statement thing. I am the living loaf of bread from God. I, the bread of life for all. Judeans, how can Jesus give us his flesh to eat? This is a great question. Do you see why Jesus even put this forth to them? Because there is an answer to this question. We have the same question, and we euphemistically solve it just like John Chrysostom did. John Chrysostom saved us, and he gave us this beautiful thing called the Eucharist. And in the Eucharist, we eat the body and blood of Christ, right? Comes from the Lord's Supper. We use that. It's a symbol, right? And it's also a reality. Look what Jesus says. It's the sacrifice. It's the sacrifice, which is the Passover, which becomes the basis later on for the Eucharist. Because Jesus is the sacrifice, the Lamb of God, then he can give us his flesh. Now, you say euphemistically, you don't physically eat his flesh. Well, I told you, if God and Christ, if Christ is that which holds the world together, and if Christ is God, right, then what are you eating when you eat the sacrifice, when you eat the manna, when you eat just natural food? You are consuming a part of God. And by the way, this goes back to the Mysterion. You just can't forget the Mysterion. All these people are steeped in Mysterion. And in the Mysterion, you always say, well, even beyond that, what are the Hebrews doing going to the temple? They are sacrificing and eating the teruma. They're eating the sacrifice. Okay? What are the Greeks doing? The Greeks are eating the sacrifice. They're eating the leftovers from their gods, right? The Mysterions, what are the Mysterions doing? The Mysterions have a meal with the deity. So when the Christians came up and said, hey, we want you to come on over to our Christian festival. Come on over. Guess what we're going to do? We're going to have a meal with Christ. And Christ is our God. And what all the Mysterian folks do? Cool. I like that. That's neat. Plus, I got to eat meat. This is the way that this is appealing both to the people, to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the Hebrews. All this is embedded within these cultures. And of course, the Hebrew answer, they know the answer. They just don't want to leap to what that means, right? Because if you leap to the answer that Jesus Christ is a sacrifice, that means he's the anointed one of God. He's a sacrifice for God, and that he is God. The Greeks, they can see this. This is philosophically right down their alley. The Romans, they're just kind of tagging along.
And the blood especially, I mean, drinking the blood was a total no-no, from the Old Testament, and God specifically said that's the life from God in the animal and so on. It's like if you're drinking, if he's telling you that's okay now, like that's the life from God. So the blood too also is, life from God.
That's right, because remember when we studied the Torah, and we made this is a huge deal in Torah. The blood is the life of the animal, not the nefesh, but the blood. And so the nefesh being the breath. The breath is not what makes life according to the Old Testament. It's the blood in the animal, and therefore they weren't supposed to eat the blood. But I've been through this before a million times, right? Can you eat meat and not eat blood? It's impossible, even if you boil it out, although that's what they did. Ugh, can you imagine? Rather have it roasted. But the Passover lamb is roasted. So you're eating blood. And what you said is right. This should, what do you call it? Like I said, it's like when you reading a word in a novel or a book or anything, and it's an odd word. And if your author was really smart, they put them in on purpose. This is on purpose. When Jesus goes on, he says, a meal of my flesh and blood, because they're not supposed to eat blood, right? At all. That's unkosher. That's bad. When he makes a claim like that it holds life perpetual, and I will stand him up. What is he making a claim to? Who owns the blood?
God.
God. Jesus just said he's God again. I mean, it's like bang, 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 bang.
That's one reason, though, it was also extra hard, and they said, well, who can accept this teaching? Because it seemed to be completely against the Torah.
Exactly. But it would be against the Torah, except if God is speaking it, right? Now, can God change the Torah? No. You got to remember this. This is deep. This is a deep Jewish idea, a deep rabbinical idea. God himself cannot change the Torah. And supposedly God himself cannot change the Mishnah, although they play with the Mishnah a lot. But the Torah is unimmutable, unchangeable. It reflects the truth in reality. However, whose rules are you playing by? God's rules. It doesn't mean that God suddenly said, you can, to the Jewish people, you can go ahead and eat blood. The Gentiles could always eat blood, right? The point is not about the eating of the blood. It's the shedding of the blood and who owns and controls the blood and the whole, the whole shlomir of creation. So he goes, life perpetual, set him up. He's partaking of me of my flesh and by me of my blood. He stays into me, and I into him. Living Father, I live through the Father, and he partaking in a meal of me likewise, that he will live through me. Again, he claims to be God. I mean, I don't know if you can claim to be God in any more ways than he's claimed to be God. It's over and over and over and over and over. And this was a statement that really got him. I live through the Father, and he's partaking in a meal of me. Likewise, he will live through me. And many disciples left. That's the way to get rid of those extra hangers on, right? They're done. Don't have to feed them or anything. And Jesus makes this statement. And this statement is general to all of his disciples that are left. It puts a snare in your way. Now, this is a very interesting statement because he said that God drags you to him. A snare, this is a double meaning, right? Because if you're caught, then you're convinced. If you're not caught, you've run away from it, right? What did these guys do? They ran away. I think this is really it's beautiful. It's beautiful. The Greeks would say, the Greek readers and hearers of this would just go, oh, this is so good. He said, you are a spectator of the signs. The snare will catch you. Conscious breath, this is it. Conscious breath, pneuma, is the making alive. Flesh is not useful. Boy, that is so Greek. That is so, very different than the Hebrew. Remember, this is what he was pounding into Nicodemus. Nicodemus, It's the pneuma, the pneuma. So it's really interesting. At the very end of his argument, that's it. And he says, my utterance is a conscious breath, and it is life. My utterance is a conscious breath, and it is life. Some, Judas, and those who left betrayed him. So this makes a statement. And then Simon Peter says this, you hold an utterance of life perpetual. We know that you are of the God. Well, we already talked about this, but I'll make this statement again. Simon Peter's wrong. Jesus says, I hold an utterance, my utterance is a conscious breath. What did he say the life perpetual was? He said, I am the bread of life. And he also said, a logos of the bread of life. So if Peter had said, you hold a logos of life perpetual, or if he said, you are life perpetual, then Jesus would not be kind of irritated at him. And if he said, we know you are God, or from God, he probably would have got away with it. But he says, you are of the God, in other words, he's not exactly there, which is what I'm telling you.
80%.
Yeah, he's 80%. He's 80%. It's really funny. Jesus makes an indirect correction to him. The logos of life perpetual, and I am God. He makes that correction to them. And then later, and the later point is, after that, it makes a statement specifically that Judas betrayed him. But we'll see that, or that he near him. But anyway, Jesus didn't go to Jerusalem for the Passover, as far as we can tell. He was too busy handling this problem. And by the way, the other people didn't either, and the disciples didn't either. The impression that you get is, do you see this? This is unseen to tell us. Jesus did not go to the Passover. Why didn't he go to the Passover? Because he wasn't Passover.
So all these people were celebrating the Passover even better.
Yes. Every person there was celebrating the Passover in the signs of Christ. And this is that is the ultimate unstated tell us of the chapter 6. Thank you, Father, for your word. Pray you look at this week. In your name we pray. Amen. I bet I need a battery.